One of the defining features of the second Trump administration has been its treatment of immigrants. The promise of mass deportations was a centerpiece of the president's election campaign and has been a priority since day one. Last year, administration officials set a quota of 3,000 arrests by immigration agents per day. They said they'd focus on people who'd committed violent crimes, what they called
the worst of the worst.
Those worst of the worst.
The worst of the worst across the country, like President Trump has told us.
But actually, ICE's own data shows that people with no criminal record now make up the largest group in immigration detention centers, like the Northwest ICE Processing Center in Tacoma, Washington, one of the largest in the country. Asylum seekers, refugees, green card holders, and others with legal status have been detained, as well as U.S. citizens. Entire families, including children, like 7-year-old Diana Crespo from Gresham, Oregon. Native Americans have had their tribal IDs questioned, like actress Elaine Miles, stopped by ICE in Redmond, Washington, something that was made possible by a Supreme Court decision allowing racial profiling at immigration stops. In the Northwest, immigration agents have arrested people at homes and businesses, on roadways, around courthouses, schools, hospitals, and elsewhere. And there have been at least 5 shootings by immigration agents so far this year. Victims include observers Renee Good and Alex Preddy, both killed in the streets of Minneapolis. In Portland, Venezuelan immigrants Luis Niño Moncada and Yorleni Zambrano Contreras were shot and injured by Border Patrol agents. In a February congressional hearing, Todd Lyons, the head of ICE, said in his opening remarks that
we are only getting started.
But in the face of all this, public sentiment about federal immigration practices has been shifting. Protests and mutual aid efforts are growing. In some places, including the Pacific Northwest, residents are mobilizing and forming community watches to support their neighbors. From the Gert Boyle studio, I'm Jen Chavez, and this is The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB about the place you call home. Today, we're collaborating with the Northwest News Network to bring together 3 reporters who cover immigration from different places in Oregon and Washington to help us get a picture of what's been happening here across our region. Holly Bartholomew is OPB's Suburban Communities reporter and a Report for America Corps member based in the Portland area. Gustavo Sagrero is a race, identity, and immigration reporter for KUOW based in the Seattle area. And Johanna Bejarano is a freelance reporter for the Northwest News Network based in Washington's Tri-Cities area. She also previously reported for Northwest Public Broadcasting. Holly, Gustavo, Johanna, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure thing.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Jenny.
So, Holly, I'd like to start with you. There has been a lot of national attention on the city of Portland in recent months, and there are many Portlanders paying close attention to this issue, but you report specifically on suburbs surrounding Portland, and there has been a lot of activity in these smaller communities. What have you been seeing in terms of how immigration agencies have been targeting folks in the suburbs versus in Portland in the urban center?
Yeah, we definitely saw a lot of attention focused on Portland, mostly starting in the fall as Trump began talking about sending the National Guard into Portland to protect the ICE facility here. And that talk about sending the Guard in coincided with a huge uptick in immigration enforcement across Oregon. And while some of that was focused in Portland, a lot of it occurred in the surrounding areas, like you said. Cities like Beaverton and Hillsborough and Forest Grove and Gresham, which all surround Portland, as well as Woodburn, which is a little bit further south, were hit particularly hard with the increase in enforcement. And those are all cities that have some of the state's most racially diverse populations, and particularly large share of Hispanic and Latino communities. Some of those jurisdictions actually even declared states of emergency over how much the enforcement was impacting those communities. And one of the groups here, the Portland Immigrants' Rights Coalition, which is a hotline that tracks ICE activity and helps connect to detainees with legal resources, reported that just in the last half of 2025. So from about July to December, there were 1,051 immigration arrests in Oregon. And of those arrests, about a third occurred in Washington County, which is just west of Portland. And then just under a third, or about 28%, occurred in Multnomah County, which is actually the county that includes Portland, but also suburban cities like Gresham and Troutdale and Fairview. And we know anecdotally from our own reporting that ICE was very active in East Portland, east of Portland in East Multnomah County in areas like Gresham. So those Multnomah County arrests were certainly not all in Portland.
Gustavo Sagrero, let me turn to you now. You've been covering immigration not only within Seattle, but also in the surrounding suburban areas as well. And I know there's been a few recent incidents you've reported on in Seattle area suburbs like Burien and Issaquah. How have you seen immigration agencies behaving in these suburban communities?
Yeah, I think definitely around the same time in fall, we saw an increase in activity in the Seattle area suburbs. These are hubs for like Latino and first generation immigrant communities. A lot of these reports, we would see stuff posted online of people being pulled over on highways or off ramps and on ramps onto I-5. And typically it these videos and from firsthand accounts that people have shared with me, it's somebody drives onto an on ramp or drives off an off ramp, and there's cars that are boxing people in, trying to push them off to the side, or in some cases even pushing or even stopping them in the middle of the road. These are happening during the early hours of the day, and it's definitely left a couple people spooked. It's definitely left a lot of the community kind of spooked about what's been going on in their communities. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, that I didn't mean to cut you off. Continue.
Sure, of course. I think the other kind of cases that we've seen is, ICE has followed a woman who was dropping off her kid to childcare or to her daycare early in the morning, and the woman was able to hand off her child to the daycare, but then they detained her. And then, it was actually kind of interesting because a week later, after the news had broke and, um, the daycare owner shared video of this arrest happening from the front of their building. Um, the daycare owner was pulled over by what she thought was at first state patrol, but then as I kind of asked her a little bit more about the details, she couldn't actually remember. And this person in particular, they had pulled her over on a highway or on the freeway, had pulled her over on the road as she was going about her errands. And they asked her for her documents. She provided a form of a real ID. The person who pulled her over didn't believe that that was a valid form of ID until she pulled out her passport and they let her go. Now she is a U.S. citizen, and she was worried about what was going on. And it's definitely sent a chill through her community. And this same day, around this time, around this day, there was also a couple other arrests that happened in Issaquah, where she's based out of. We also have the story of a gentleman from the story of Juan. He's a gentleman from Burien. He has a family of his own, but his uncle was arrested by immigration enforcement a couple weeks back now in October, and same situation. Sorry, let me take a couple steps back and say, his uncle was pulled over on the side of a road. They took him away, and then Juan went to go check up on his family who lived in the neighborhood, and just to see what they were doing. And then the next day, after he went home, the next day, he says he was pulled over by immigration, and they asked for his documents, and then he told them that he presented his documents that he was DACA, and then they let him go. Since we've reported on the story of Juan, we later found out that his uncle was deported. He's been in Mexico for the past 3 weeks with the family there, but he's going to apply for legal status into the country again, and they're talking with attorneys about what to do next. The Berrien City Council has also just passed an immigration support measure that'll basically add funds to do Know Your Rights outreach and prepare immigrant families and businesses from being separated or from being impacted. Like many smaller cities, they're concerned with being proactive when it comes to passing local laws and legislation that so they often rely on the larger county governments, in our case King County, to take bolder steps and sometimes potentially making themselves, because if these smaller city governments take steps in their own ways, that could potentially make themselves targets for the federal government. So they don't want to do that, and they're kind of keeping themselves within what the county has already established.
Thank you, Gustavo. And Johanna Bejarano, I know you've been reporting in the Tri-Cities area of Eastern Washington. I know a big story you're working on there now involves immigrants on the path to becoming naturalized citizens. Could you tell us about the man whose case you've been following and the challenges he's been having?
Yeah, Jen, I have been following the case of Avelino Gonzalez. He's a 74-year-old legal Cuban resident whose naturalization ceremony was canceled in December. So it's similar to the stories we have been seeing nationally with people from other nationalities around the country. So Gonzalez's ceremony was scheduled for December the 12th in Yakima, but a day before he received a call from his lawyer telling him that the ceremony was canceled. So his lawyer told me that he didn't receive written notification from the U.S. Citizen and Immigration Services about this cancellation or the reasons for the decision. And she found out because she checked Gonzalez's case status on the agency website. So it has been 2 months, and neither Gonzalez nor his lawyer has received any update or what will happen with this ceremony. This person has been living in the country for almost 30 years as a legal resident. He told me knowing his naturalization ceremony was pretty disappointing for him because he waited a lot to make the decision to become a citizen. And now he doesn't understand what he's facing this situation. But basically, his lawyer says, like, Cuba, because he's originally from Cuba, Cuba is part of these countries that are in the list of countries that have their immigration processes paused, and is also in another list that include countries that where people is not allowed to come to the U.S. So those travel ban list. And now, well, his case is in kind of a limbo because the naturalization ceremony is the final step, essentially is the last step in becoming a U.S. citizen, is where you officially take the oath of alliance. But there is not anything his lawyer or Gonzalez can do to solve the situation. So the only way right now is to wait.
Yeah. And while you've been working on this story, I'm curious, what have you learned from others you have talked to about the process of taking legal pathways within the immigration system like this?
Well, it's becoming difficult for everybody. For example, I talk also with another lawyer who is well, I talked with another person from an organization that help people to go to the citizenship process, and she told me that people from Mexico also have had their naturalization ceremonies canceled. It's the case of 17 people in the Yakima Valley who was ready for this big day for them, and now they are in line. But the unique aspect here is like this person has been notified that it was a clerical error at the U.S. CIS office in Yakima, and these people who are originally from Mexico are still in line for their naturalization ceremony, but they have not received a new date. I also talked with a lawyer in Portland, Oregon. He told me that he had other naturalizations application processes, and it has been delays in the process. For example, after the interview, it can be like 4 months, and they have not received any notification about the ceremony or something like that. So basically, the processes are delayed. And also, people who is looking for other kind of visas, for example, U visas, who are for people who have been victims of criminal cases or activities or also victims of domestic violence. These U visas petitions processes also had experienced delays. So it's kind of the whole situation of immigration, and the changes are affecting everybody, not just people who is undocumented, but also people who is looking for naturalization or have asylum cases or any other path that they are looking for getting their documentation.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your reporting with us, Johanna, on that. Gustavo, I want to turn back to you because I know a lot of the stories that you have been working on recently involve unlawful actions or rights violations by federal immigration agencies. And that can sometimes involve people with legal status or folks who are checking in with authorities like they're supposed to, or people not getting their due process rights. Could you give us a few examples of the ways in which you're seeing this in your area?
Yeah, and now that you asked me this question, and I'm just kind of going back through the Rolodex of stories in my mind, there's a lot that kind of come through.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that's important to note is that there is a rise of unlawful arrests and subsequent habeas corpus filings because of this stepped up immigration enforcement. These are people who are held in Tacoma or elsewhere. And many of these attorneys are arguing, hey, like this person that was taken into this facility, they don't actually belong there. This person has done XYZ things correctly. Or, a better example is the story of Alan Fitzatticone. He's a gentleman who came as a refugee in the 90s, was, convicted of, he was convicted of bank fraud. And this was during the time when he was a teenager. He had just had a baby, and he was trying to figure out what to do with the rest of his life. And he pled guilty to a charge, and he pled guilty to the charge. And with the attorney that was working with him at the time, it told him like, hey, like if you plead guilty to this charge, like there won't be any immigration consequences. Flash forward to today, Alan is now out. He has an entirely different life. He has a wife, a few kids. Some of them have gone off to college, and he's been checking in regularly with Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, almost now at this point on a weekly basis. And then, in one of his recent check-ins late last year, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement took him into custody and they sent him to the Northwest ICE Processing Center. In that situation, immigration check-ins like this situation are pretty common, especially for Alan, who's a refugee from a country that won't take him back. And so, this was really surprising to the family. This practice of going in regularly to check in with ICE, it became an everyday thing, like going to church on a Sunday. And, they would plan their days and their weeks around this. But this recent change last year with his detention kind of threw the whole family into chaos of trying to figure out what the heck's going on, And when the Seattle Clemency Project filed the habeas corpus case, they argued that, hey, like you didn't notify Mr. Fitzatticone that he was going to be detained for deportation, that he was subject to deportation. You have to notify him. And it's essentially the simplest thing of, it essentially boils down to paperwork and bureaucracy for Alan. And that's eventually what kind of saved him. Now he's out and he won that case. And now he's still checking in with ICE, but now he has a chance to reapply for an adjustment of status. His whole family are U.S. citizens, and they're going to try and keep him in the United States. There's something to be said. I mean, so that's just one story of somebody who ends up in the Northwest ICE Processing Center, and that overlaps with the conversation of the violations of law or unlawful actions. Bigger picture, we have a program at the University of Washington called the University of Washington Center for Human Rights, and they were keeping eyes and tabs about how these deportations have been playing out and if it's crossed any boundaries. And they ultimately found that, there have been rights violations that have happened. And it's not just, the federal government, but local governments in some ways are complicit, either because, or allegedly complicit because of how they enable this. And the violations extend to, enforced disappearances where people are picked up by immigration and customs enforcement and they're taken away, and they don't have access to family or attorney in the circumstances that they found. And in some cases, some of these people have been sent to the CICOT prison in El Salvador, where there's been allegations of torture that have happened to the people who have been sent there. That's kind of a big red flag in this circumstance. The most interesting example that I've seen, and those are examples that definitely capture my attention. But then there's also examples about how tribal members throughout the United States are kind of engaging with this as well. For example, there was a actress by the name of Elaine Miles. She was at a bus stop pretty close to where an immigration enforcement action was happening, and she says that when I reached out to her to talk to her about how everything went down, she says that when immigration and customs enforcement officers, when immigration officers approached her, they asked her for some sort of valid ID that could prove that she was a citizen. And she would tell them that she was a tribal member, and then she provided her tribal ID. And they at first didn't believe what she was saying. And, after some back and forth, other officers pulled the officer that was interrogating her away, and she was able to move on with the rest of her day. That Miles' detention and other tribal members across the country, this has sparked a conversation in the tribes in the Pacific Northwest to actually put forward a draft of rules collectively, saying that that basically demands all federal agencies, especially from DHS, ICE, Border Patrol, to notify and consult and coordinate with the tribal nations before entering any tribal treaty or reservation territories. They also demanded DHS and ICE to follow laws by acknowledging tribally issued photo ID cards as acceptable photo IDs and proof of tribal citizenship and American citizenship status.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Thank you, Gustavo. Johanna, I want to turn back to you because I know another thing that both you and Gustavo have reported on in Washington is the use of surveillance technology like flock license plate reading cameras. And this technology is often used by local law enforcement, but federal immigration agencies have been able to access that data. And some cities in Oregon and Washington have shut off these cameras due to public concern. How have you been seeing this come up in your area?
Well, it's kind of the same. So there's concern about the use of these cameras in general in Washington state. So we have seen that in central Washington and on the west side and also in areas on the eastern side of the state. I have reported on the use of these cameras in the Yakima Valley and central Washington, because at the time people was really concerned about the report from the University of Washington that showed that immigration enforcement have had access to information from these cameras. So we knew about cases in Wenatchee, Richland, Sunnyside, Leywood, in Yakima itself. different organizations, and I am talking about community organizations, have been asking the police departments to shut down the cameras or at least turn them off temporarily. Are things that have been discussed in city councils many times. I have talked also with chiefs of with people from police departments who had told me that they are not using or sharing the information with immigration enforcement. And apparently there was like kind of option that these cameras had that allow or open the door to federal agencies to take some information from there. I know, for example, that the Central Washington Resistance was one of the organizations to send a petition to the Yakima Council to turn the cameras off. It's my understanding until today that that petition has not been answered yet. But I also talked with the Yakima Police Department, and they said they were not using these cameras for immigration purposes, especially because the Keep Washington Working Act doesn't allow local and state police departments to share information with immigration authorities. Still, the concern is there, and the community, of course, want a solution to keep their privacy and of course, be protected from immigration operations.
Well, we're going to take a quick break now, but coming up next, we'll hear about the ripple effects of immigration arrests on entire families in Oregon and Washington, and about how Northwesterners are helping their neighbors. Thank you for listening to The Evergreen, our podcast from OPB about the place you call home. If you've learned something new from this episode, subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app, and we'll keep the contextual deep dives into important stories in the Pacific Northwest coming every Monday morning. You can also follow OPB on Instagram at OPB Photo, or follow me directly at Jen Chavez OPB. That's Jen with 2 N's, and I'll keep you posted on what Team Evergreen is up to. And remember, this episode about immigration reporting across the Northwest and all the great journalism and storytelling you hear on this show is made possible by the support of many thousands of public media members. Support OPB's journalism by becoming a sustaining member today at opb.org/pod. Support KUOW's journalism as a monthly donor, which purely by coincidence is called an Evergreen member at kuow.org/evergreen, and visit nwnewsnetwork.org to find a list of all our Northwest partner organizations and more ways to help power public media in our region. And now, back to the show. Holly, I want to turn back to you. I know one common theme in all three of y'all's work is how entire families have been affected by arrests and deportations. And Holly, a big story you've been covering recently touches on ICE activity in the area of a medical setting. It involves a family from Gresham, the suburb to the east of Portland. A couple was trying to bring their daughter into urgent care at a Portland hospital because she had a bloody nose that wouldn't stop. They were arrested in the parking lot before they could get inside. And you've been following this for multiple weeks. Can you fill us in on what's been happening with that family?
So the Crespo Gonzalez family was recently released from a detention center in Texas where they were held for 3 weeks. The family was initially detained on January 16th, and like you mentioned, it was in the parking lot of a Portland hospital where they were trying to get care for their 7-year-old daughter, Diana. Prior to last year, certain sensitive areas like hospitals and schools and churches were off limits for immigration enforcement, but the Trump administration threw out that policy last January. And so we have seen a few instances here in Oregon of arrests at hospitals and schools. And this one was actually one of the first we know of one at a medical setting. But anyway, we know that that family, they actually had a pending asylum application and that the parents had work permits But apparently, when they entered the country in 2024 in California, they made their appointment with Border Patrol through an app called CBP1, which was widely used previously, but has since been eliminated by the Trump administration. And so that is the justification, because the app is no longer valid, that their asylum application is no longer valid. Or, sorry, I should say that's the Trump administration's justification. But after their arrest, the family wound up at the South Texas Family Residential Center in Dilley, Texas, which is the same facility as Liam Ramos, that 5-year-old boy from Minnesota with the little blue bunny hat, whose story became a huge nationwide sensation. And the Crespo Gonzalez family was at that detention center for 3 weeks. And there were some pretty serious concerns for the health and well-being of 7-year-old Diana, partly because she was on the way to the doctor when she was detained, but also because she got a fever in the first couple days while they were at the facility, and she didn't get to see a doctor until they had been there for 5 days. We also know that the facility has been widely accused of failing to provide adequate medical care and food and water for detainees. A relative of the family that I spoke with actually told me that the water was making Diana sick, which is pretty consistent with what we've heard from other detainees at that facility. So they had to just purchase bottled water just to be able to drink water. That relative also said Diana was only eating bread with mayonnaise because the food at the facility was so poor, and just as a little kid, she's kind of a picky eater. And it sounds like she actually ended up losing weight during their 3 weeks at the facility. But this story ended up causing a lot of outrage among the public and among leaders in Oregon. And so one of our representatives in Congress, Maxine Dexter, actually went to Texas to try and visit the family. And she ended up not only getting to see the family, but getting them out of detention and bringing them home to Oregon. And the story of how she actually got them home is kind of interesting to me. Dexter, who's also a doctor, tried to get into the detention center twice, and she was denied entry both times. But on that second attempt, officials at the facility told her she could have a video chat with the family instead. But Dexter said she wanted to see them and talk to them in person, and also try and evaluate Diana's health, because there had been these concerns. And apparently when she said this, the supervisor at the facility said, okay, we're just going to let the family go. And so they brought the family out to the parking lot where Dexter was, and she flew home to Oregon with them. And so they're back home, but there's still some serious concerns about why she wasn't let in, and fears about kind of what that means of, like, are they hiding something that they didn't want her to see? Members of Congress are supposed to be allowed to make unannounced visits to immigration detention facilities to kind of perform oversight. And because that wasn't allowed, there's just concerns about what's going on there.
Well, I know you'll continue covering that story here at OPB. Gustavo, I want to turn back to you. You have also been doing some really in-depth coverage of one family that you've been following since the father of the family, Armando, was arrested not long after Inauguration Day last year. And I think he was deported to Guatemala. And in the months since, you've gotten a glimpse of how his entire family has been affected, including family members who went with Armando and family members who stayed here. Can you tell us a little bit more about their story and what you've been learning from talking to them and getting to know them?
Sure. What ultimately happened to the family was that the 3 youngest kids and Armando's wife Leticia ended up going back to Guatemala to be there with him, and then the 2 oldest boys of the family stayed behind. The 2 oldest boys are like 18, and the older brother's in his early 20s. And there was a lot of tension in the family about what to do next when Armando was first arrested. I want to pull the camera back and say that Armando was arrested outside of a church pretty soon after President Trump had signed that executive order saying that ICE can conduct arrests, or allowing ICE to conduct, or allowing immigration enforcement to conduct arrests on schools, churches, and hospitals. And for this family, it was very much a shock. Armando had no criminal record. He had previous run-ins with ICE or with Immigration and Customs Enforcement or Border Patrol. It was more than a decade ago. Or pretty close to a decade ago, he got a deportation order, and he elected to self-deport, but he never really did. At that point, he was a young father with a couple kids around him, and he didn't want to be put in the situation that they are now. Um, you know, because of the mixed status of the family, I also need to acknowledge that the three kids who went back to Guatemala are U.S. citizens.
Mm.
And there's a lot of questions about, how are the kids adjusting? Are they eating well? I mean, not that they're eating well, but, how are they adjusting to the new life that they have? Um, One of the children, a young boy, he's entering school at a really interesting age. Right now, he should be transitioning towards middle school, but instead, he's having to learn Spanish and even pick up Quiche, which is the Mayan language in Guatemala, or one of the Mayan languages in Guatemala. And he's really struggling. But it's funny because in some ways, he's also very much ahead in his schooling. He'll go to his parents and say, like, "Hey, like I already learned all this stuff. Like,
Hmm.
why am I learning it again?" And so the family is, really stuck between trying to figure out what to do next. Armando has a 10-year bar to re-enter the country. So he can't really do anything until then. He can apply for some sort of, adjustment, maybe some help, but that's a long shot, especially now. Um, Leticia, the wife, the one of the older boys who are here in the United States, he's about 3 years from turning 21, so he could try and apply for her, but she also has all these legal tensions that she needs to figure out, and it's very much like a Jenga block situation for the family of trying to shift things here and move things there. Who can come back? Who can't? And ultimately, they want the kids back in the United States, and the parents want to be back to support them. Um, but that's pretty hard. And, the two brothers could take care of the three kids, but that's a pretty heavy that's a pretty heavy responsibility for three young men who, and it's been done before. There are young adult parents, but these two young men aren't really sure about how to like make that happen, and so they're really stuck in the situation that they're trying to figure out next. Um, you know, Alex, who's the who's the second oldest son. He's been the centerpiece for a couple of the features that we've done on this family. He's kind of found himself at odds about his American identity. You know, um, he represents millions of Americans across the U.S. These are U.S. citizens with adults in their home who don't have legal status, often parents. So when one of their families, like his, is going through this during this point in our country's history, he says this lessens the part of his identity of being American.
Johanna, in some of your past reporting on immigrant farm workers, you have also looked into how families have been affected when their loved ones are arrested or deported. And I mean, it seems like some of the family members of the workers whose stories you followed have dealt with some similar struggles to the family Gustavo has been following, right? What are some of the stories that you turned up when doing that reporting?
Yeah, then it was a reporting in collaboration with the Yakima Herald Republic, actually, and we followed the stories of different farm workers' families who were like in a difficult decision, like staying in the country or going to their native country. We reported on the story, for example, of Alfredo Lelo Juarez, who is a well-known farm worker organizer in Washington. He was detained last year in March in Skagit County and spent almost 4 months in the Tacoma Detention Center, trying to go out, trying to defend his case to stay in the United States. But finally, he decided to leave voluntarily. And his family started conversations about what to do because they didn't want to face a family separation. Finally, his parents decided to go to Mexico, so the whole family went there to avoid this trauma that his siblings could experience because they were not together. And we also followed the story of Jamie Ortiz. Her husband was detained too while he was going to work in the fields. He was also in the Tacoma Center, but it was not possible for him to stay in the country. So in both cases, Alfredo Juarez and Jamie Ortiz's husband, if, a deportation order from the past was present in these cases. So at the end, in Jamie Ortiz's case, his husband was deported. I understand that she traveled to Mexico, but they were discussing all the decisions that could keep the families together and look like for the better outcome for them. I think it's the situation of many families. So trying to plan what to do, and it's affecting farm workers' families in the region in Washington State, but other families too. During this reporting, I learned also from different community organizations that are trying to help the families to create emergency plans, and these emergency plans include legal documentation that can allow them to leave their children with a person they trust in case parents are detained or something happened to them. So it's the kind of things that the communities are doing right now in Washington State to keep themselves safe and try to navigate the whole situation.
Holly, I think one thing that feels important for us to pay attention to, is the way community members are responding to the targeting of their neighbors. And we have been seeing a lot of this community response work being done in Minnesota, for example, but many other places too. You've been covering this in the community of Hillsborough, about 20 miles west of Portland. What have people been doing there that you've seen?
So I've covered a couple of different ways that people in Hillsborough are helping their neighbors as a response to all of this. The first one started back in October as ICE activity was really picking up. And that's when a dad was arrested about a block away from an elementary school in Hillsborough after dropping off his kid at school. So the teachers at that school and at a nearby middle school started going out into the neighborhood early before school just to keep an eye out on things and make sure that kids and families felt safe as they walked to school. Apparently, ICE had been seen driving around that neighborhood several times in the morning, even before that dad was arrested. So these teachers just went out to establish a presence in the area. And ultimately, the teachers know that they probably wouldn't be able to stop ICE from arresting someone if they were really after a particular person. The teachers aren't armed or anything. They're just teachers. But from what they said, ICE would generally drive away once they saw them out there. And then the other community response in Hillsborough that I covered was this mutual aid group that delivers food and other essentials to people who are either afraid to leave their homes because of ICE or who have had their primary breadwinner detained. This group got started around the same time in October as the ICE activity was really picking up. And it got started actually by this group working with the school district to identify families who might need a little extra help. And then from there, someone would tell a friend or a family member or a neighbor. And so they ended up serving about 60 families a week by just delivering boxes of groceries and whatever the family needed. And I don't want to give the impression by kind of describing how this spread through word of mouth. I don't want to give the impression that this was all out in the open and advertised, because it most definitely was not. The group took security very seriously, just given everything going on and the fact that the families that they were delivering to were staying inside and hiding for a reason. They were super careful about security. They vetted everyone who became a volunteer. They used encrypted channels for all of their communication and logistic work. They turned off their phones when making deliveries so their GPS data couldn't be tracked. They did everything possible to keep it as secure as they could. And as some of the group's main organizers are Hispanic and Latino, and some come from mixed status families themselves, they acknowledge that doing this work put them at some sort of risk. But also, because of how personal it was to them, they felt like that risk was worth it.
I just want to wrap up our conversation today with a question for all three of you. We are witnessing a big escalation by the federal government around this issue of immigration. And it feels like there are more newsworthy things happening on this every day than is possible to keep up with. And I think doing journalism in this environment is becoming more challenging in multiple ways. And I'm curious what all of your experiences have been in these recent times as journalists focusing on immigration. What is it like for you covering this topic? Maybe, Holly, let's stay with you for this one.
Yeah, it can be difficult, certainly, to hear the stories of families who are separated from loved ones or struggling in a detention center. I think the detention of Diana, the 7-year-old, was one of the hardest ones for me to hear about. But I also think the things that make these stories hard to cover and difficult to grapple with are also what make them so important to cover. These are stories that deserve to be told, and as a journalist, I kind of feel an obligation to help bring them to light.
Gustavo, what about you? What has it been like for you covering this topic?
There's been a couple of times already that I've asked Immigrations and Customs Enforcement to see if I could accompany them on a ride-along and report out, what this ride-along was like. They haven't responded to my requests. So, they're kind of hard when it comes to trying to talk with them and engage with them in the way that we should be doing our job, right? We should always be reaching out to all the factors of this story. I'm not saying both sides. I'm saying, I'm saying more like, here's the thing that happened, and we have to report on, the as concisely and as effectively as possible about what's going on, and so people know what's happening, and they have all the context they need to understand how these circumstances, all the parties that are responsible for this, we can understand what their responsibilities are, and what are the consequences of some of the actions for those responsibilities. I think that's one of the things that I'm really interested in. But they don't provide that for us. So instead, at least me as a journalist, I've had to kind of take what I call like a wannabe forensic approach, where, I look back and I take a larger scale about all these different actions that have been happening over the past couple of months, past year, to understand really how is immigration enforcement changing our region. Personally, I've had people ask me, are you going to be carrying your passport with you? And, I still haven't answered that question yet, and I don't think I will, but I think people asking me if I'm taking my passport with me raises the question of what's really going on here? You know what I mean? That's, that also sits with me as I'm working through my day-to-day work.
Johanna, what about you? What has it been like for you covering this topic?
Well, I echoed what Gustavo and Holly has said. This human perspective, sometimes it's really hard to hear the stories of the community and what is happening, but I think it's also a big responsibility for us to keep, these voices alive. So allow everybody to understand what is happening from their perspective. I think it's really challenging to get all the sides of the stories when you don't have answers from the agencies, like the federal agencies, and it's like at this point, I need to be more persistent to be able to go get these answers that I need, so people can have the whole perspective. Another thing is like doing training on immigration coverage has allowed me also to create network with reporters from different places in the country, including Minnesota, and it's really difficult to hear from others how we need to wear protective gear, or trying to do things that we can imagine you need to do in other countries where the freedom of the press or the journalist work is in some way more in risk. So not here in the United States. So it didn't come to my mind before. But those safety measures are more important right now. And it caught my attention, Gustavo talking about the passport part, because I am one of those persons who carry the passport in my wallet. And I have been asked the same. So it's like we are taking different kind of measures to be able to do our work and keep our communities informed and giving them all the information they really need. So it's challenging, definitely.
Well, I just want to thank so much all three of you for all the work you've been doing, and for joining us today and sharing your reporting. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Sure thing.
Thank you.
Johanna Bejarano is a freelance reporter for the Northwest News Network based in Washington's Tri-Cities area. Gustavo Sagrero is KUOW's race, identity, and immigration reporter based in the Seattle area. And Holly Bartholomew is OPB's suburban communities reporter and a Report for America Corps member based in the Portland area. You can find links to reporting they've shared today and more in our show notes. Find more Oregon and Washington immigration coverage at opb.org and KUOW.org. Special thanks to KUOW and our public media partners in the Northwest News Network for collaborating with OPB on today's podcast. Partners also include KNKX, KLCC, Spokane Public Radio, Northwest Public Broadcasting, and Jefferson Public Radio. Visit nwnewsnetwork.org to learn more. I produced today's episode, and our technical director is Stephen Cray. He also engineered this episode. OPB's podcast team also includes Mia Estrada, Julie Sabatier, and Sage Van Wing. And we received video support from OPB's Prakruti Bhatt and Joey Lovato. You heard news clips in this episode from CBS, MS Now, and PBS. Music in this episode comes from Audio Network. If you have a question for us now or ever, please reach out. Send us an email at theevergreen@opb.org. I'm Jen Chavez. Catch you later.